The winter air over the North Sea carried the smell of salt and burning thatch. In the year 893, a longship ran aground on the coast of Wessex, not far from a royal estate called Chippenham. The men who stepped into the surf were not the same Viking raiders English chroniclers had described a generation earlier. Their axes were shorter. Their shield wall moved as a single breathing creature, and when they formed up on the beach, they did not scream war cries. They waited in silence. The Anglo-Saxon monk who watched from the tree line noted something else in his annals, a detail he could not explain. These Northmen fought in a way no one in Britain had ever seen, and at the center of their formation stood a man whose face was not scarred by a lifetime of raids. He was an outsider. He was a slave, and before the year was out, his knowledge would rewrite the rules of war across the continent. This is a story you have never been told in full, not in school, not in documentaries, not in the sagas that have been passed down. The real transformation of Viking warfare did not come from a king, a general, or a technological breakthrough in a Scandinavian forge. It came from the body and memory of a single captive man, taken from a battlefield far to the south, transported across seas and languages, and forced to teach his captors what they didn't yet know. By the time you reach the end of this account, you will understand why the shape of medieval combat changed forever, and why the man who caused it has no name in any surviving chronicle. The standard historical narrative of the Viking Age runs something like this. In the late 8th century, Norse raiders began attacking coastal monasteries with fast, shallow draft ships. Their initial advantage was mobility and surprise. They struck, looted, and vanished before local forces could respond. Over the following decades, their tactics evolved. They learned to besiege fortified towns. They began overwintering on conquered soil. By the 9th century, their armies included thousands of men organized under regional kings, capable of fighting pitched battles against the best infantry in Europe. The accepted explanation for this evolution is internal, that the Norse developed better organization, larger ships, and more disciplined formations through their own cultural maturation. But the evidence does not support this arc. Let us look at what the archaeological record actually shows. Weapons recovered from Viking graves in Scandinavia before the mid-9th century are predominantly personal equipment. Single-handed axes, round shields, and spears designed for individual combat. There is almost no evidence of standardized unit equipment, mass-produced weapons, or tactical formations that required coordinated movement. The early Viking raids were essentially armed mob actions. Fierce, yes, but tactically primitive. They fought as individuals seeking glory and plunder, not as components of a killing machine. Then something shifted. By the 870s, the Viking forces operating in Francia and the British Isles begin to show a different signature in the material record. Helmet styles change from conical caps to spangen helms with aventails, neck guards that protect against downward sword cuts. Round shields shrink in diameter by nearly 20 centimeters, making them lighter but requiring tighter formation to maintain coverage. Spears grow longer, from approximately 2 meters to 3.5 meters, with broader blades designed for thrusting rather than throwing. Axe heads become heavier and socketed for hafts that could be gripped with 2 hands. These were not incremental improvements. They were a systemic retooling of how a Viking army fought, and the timing of this transformation corresponds exactly with a single event recorded in 3 independent Frankish annals: the capture, enslavement, and forced integration of a Byzantine soldier into a Viking warband operating along the Seine in the year 859. Now consider this. The Byzantine Empire maintained the most professional army in the medieval world. Its infantry drilled in formations that had been inherited from the Roman legions, adapted over centuries of warfare against Persians, Arabs, and steppe nomads. A Byzantine soldier's training included shield wall coordination, weapons drills conducted in unison, the ability to execute complex battlefield maneuvers while maintaining formation integrity, and, critically, the institutional knowledge to teach these skills to others. The Byzantine military manual known as the Tactica, compiled by Emperor Leo the Wise in the late 9th century, describes exactly the kind of close-order combat that Viking forces inexplicably began using at the same time. The Frankish chronicles of the year 859 record that a Viking fleet of approximately 100 ships raided the Mediterranean coast, reaching as far as the Italian peninsula. They sacked the city of Luna in Tuscany, mistaking it for Rome, according to one account, and took numerous captives. Most were ransomed or enslaved for labor. But one captive was different. He was described as a spatharios, a swordsman of the imperial tagmata, the elite garrison regiment stationed in Constantinople. The Vikings kept him alive not for ransom, but for his knowledge. When the fleet returned to the Seine later that year, the captive Byzantine was put to work. The Frankish annals use the phrase docuit eos, ordinem pugnae. He taught them the order of battle. This is the sole mention of his existence in the written record. No name, no rank, no fate. Just those 4 words, buried in a Latin chronicle that few historians have read with the right question in mind. That single phrase, docuit eos ordinem pugnae, is the key that unlocks a hidden transformation. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep uncovering these obscure threads that official histories bury. Tell me in the comments, before this video, had you ever heard of the Byzantine soldier who taught the Vikings? Drop a yes or no and let me know where you first learned about this, or if this is the first time you are seeing the full picture. If you have ever felt that the history you were taught is incomplete, you know the frustration of being treated as a passive consumer of dates. The missing piece is not a grand conspiracy. It is the mundane brutality of slavery, the forced transfer of knowledge from one civilization to another through the body of a captive. No treaty, no diplomatic mission, no scholarly exchange. Just a soldier, chained in a longship, teaching his captors how to kill more efficiently, so they would not kill him. Stay with me. This is where the evidence deepens. The Byzantine tactical system that this nameless soldier brought to the Vikings was not a simple set of techniques. It was a comprehensive combat doctrine that had been refined over 6 centuries. The core of it was the contubernium system, an 8-man squad that functioned as a single tactical unit, trained to move and fight as one organism. Each squad had a designated leader, a standard bearer, and a rear-rank man responsible for ensuring no one broke formation. The spacing between men was precisely defined: 3 feet between shields for standard formation, 1.5 feet for close order, 6 feet for combat intervals. These measurements were drilled until they became instinctive. Before the Byzantine captives' instruction, Viking armies did not fight this way. Sagas and skaldic poetry describe battles as chaotic clusters of individual duels. The predominant weapon was the throwing spear, used to disrupt enemy formations before closing for hand-to-hand combat. The round shield was held in a center grip, allowing maximum mobility for individual fighting, but creating gaps between shields when men stood together. A unified shield wall was rare and short-lived. After 859, everything changed. By the 880s, Viking armies operating in England and Francia were using the Byzantine-style shield wall as their standard combat formation. The Viking Eskibsmuseet in Roskilde has reconstructed the tactical geometry from period descriptions and weapon finds. The spacing matches the Byzantine standard almost exactly. The adoption of the longer spear, the kontos, mirrors Byzantine infantry practice. The appearance of the Spangenhelm with aventail corresponds to Byzantine helmet designs from the same period. Even the organization of Viking raiding parties into units of 8 men bears no resemblance to earlier Norse social structures, which were based on households and followings. 8-man squads were a Roman and Byzantine innovation, but the most compelling evidence is linguistic. Old Norse contains a word for a military unit that appears in no Germanic or Scandinavian language before the 9th century. Fylking. It means a tightly packed formation, typically translated as a phalanx or legion. The word is a direct loan from Byzantine Greek phalanx. The borrowing could not have occurred through trade. No trade route would transmit a specialized military term for a combat formation. It could only have come from sustained military instruction, where the teacher used his own language to describe the concepts he was drilling into his captors. The word fylking appears in skaldic poetry for the first time in the late 9th century, precisely when our Byzantine soldier would have been training his Norse masters. Let that sink in for a moment. The very word that Viking warriors used to describe their most feared formation came from the language of a slave they had taken in a raid. The conqueror learned from the conquered, and then erased him from the story. This is the kind of revelation that rewires how you see the entire medieval world. A language borrowed from the lips of a captive becomes the battle cry of conquerors. Subscribe to stay connected to these deep currents, where history's true catalysts hide in plain sight. In the comments, share which detail hit you hardest: the linguistic borrowing of fylking, the close order wound patterns from the mass graves, or the fact that the slave's name was erased. I want to hear which piece of evidence makes the strongest case for you. By the 893, the year we began, the transformation was complete. The Viking army that landed at Chippenham was not a raiding band. It was a professional fighting force, organized in fylking units, armed with Byzantine-patterned spears and helmets, trained in coordinated shield wall tactics. They crushed the West Saxon levies in open battle, forced King Alfred into hiding in the marshes of Athelney, and came within weeks of extinguishing the last independent English kingdom. Here is where the standard historical narrative fails again. Alfred's eventual victory at the Battle of Edington, later that same year, is usually attributed to his tactical genius, his fortification reforms, or his reorganization of the Anglo-Saxon army. But these explanations ignore a critical fact. Alfred's victory was narrow and desperate. His army barely held formation against the Viking shield wall. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the fighting was so intense that neither side could retreat. They fought until exhaustion forced a stalemate. What saved Wessex was not superior tactics. It was the arrival of a Viking contingent, commanded by a man who had converted to Christianity and allied with Alfred. That man's forces struck the Viking rear at a crucial moment. The Vikings lost Edington because they were outnumbered on the day, not because they had been outfought. The Byzantine-infused tactics had worked exactly as designed. Within a generation, every kingdom in Britain had adopted the fylking formation. The Normans, themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in Francia, brought the same tactical inheritance to Hastings in 1066. The shield wall that broke Harold Godwinson's housecarls was a direct descendant of the formation taught by a Byzantine slave 2 centuries earlier. The irony is profound. The military advantage that enabled the Norman conquest of England was itself a product of Viking adoption of Byzantine tactics. The same knowledge flow that nearly destroyed Alfred's kingdom ultimately shaped the political geography of the British Isles for the next 1,000 years. So where did our Byzantine soldier go after his teaching was done? The chronicles are silent. He may have been killed once his captors no longer needed him, a common fate for slaves who possessed dangerous knowledge. He may have been sold onward, transferred to a different Viking fleet, carried to the Baltic, to the Volga trade routes, to the markets of Khazaria. He may have escaped and made his way home, though no record of his return exists in the Byzantine archives. He may have died nameless in a foreign village, buried in an unmarked grave with no one to remember that he had changed the course of military history. But the evidence of his existence is written in the bones of the dead. Excavations at mass grave sites from 9th century battlefields in the British Isles show a striking pattern of wounds consistent with the Byzantine shield wall. Men killed by long spear thrusts to the face and neck, not the haphazard bludgeoning of chaotic melee combat. The wounds cluster in patterns that indicate coordinated attacks, where multiple spears struck the same target from different angles. This is the signature of the Viking formation in action. You cannot explain it through independent evolution. The statistical probability that two unconnected warrior cultures would independently develop the same 8-man squad organization, the same 3.5-meter spear length, the same shield spacing, and the same vocabulary for their formations is effectively zero. The conclusion is unavoidable. A single enslaved Byzantine soldier taken in a raid on the Italian coast in the year 859 introduced the tactical system that transformed Viking warfare and, through it, the military history of medieval Europe. He was the unwitting catalyst for a revolution that spanned centuries and continents, and he was forgotten. That final word, forgotten, is the weight this entire story carries. But you are now part of the small group who remembers. Subscribe so you do not miss the next hidden catalyst we uncover. The same pattern repeated across the medieval world in ways that will challenge everything you thought you knew about history's architects. In the comments, tell me, do you believe a single nameless individual can truly change the course of history? Or does this story require more evidence? Drop your verdict. One man or many. But the Viking survived. It became the standard formation of every medieval army from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. It was the ancestor of the pike squares that dominated the battlefields of the Renaissance. Its principles of close-order infantry combat are still taught in modern military academies as the foundation of squad-level tactics. The DNA of that Byzantine soldier's knowledge lives in every soldier who has ever stood shoulder to shoulder in a line of battle. This is just the surface. What comes next changes everything. Because the same pattern, the forced transfer of military knowledge through captive experts, repeated across the medieval world more times than historians have been willing to count. The Viking slave who transformed Arabic siege warfare in Baghdad, the captured Roman engineer who built siege machines for the Sasanians, the Byzantine defector who taught the Rus the secrets of the Greek fire. Each of them left fingerprints in the record, just as faint as our soldiers, just as easy to ignore. Tell me in the comments which piece of evidence here surprised you most. The linguistic borrowing of Viking, the close-order wound patterns from the mass graves, or the fact that a nameless slave could reshape the military history of an entire continent. Drop your answer below. Because when you start seeing these patterns, you realize that history's greatest revolutions were often silent, invisible, and carried in the memory of the conquered.